You're listening to the I'm Busy Being Awesome podcast with Paula Engebretson, episode number 246. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. How are you? I am recording this introduction to the podcast after editing what's going to be the next two episodes, all about navigating big emotions. So it was originally going to be one episode. I had everything ready. I recorded it all. And it turns out I had a lot to say about this topic. It turned out to be almost 50 minutes long. And here's the deal. I know you all have busy days and things to do, and listening to me talk for 50 minutes straight is not likely one of those things on your list. So what I decided to do is divide this episode into two parts. Part one, which is what you're hearing today, is going to help us really build our awareness around the specific big emotions that so many of us ADHD brains navigate in different situations, particularly when we are in public around other humans. So we're going to explore several common emotions that a lot of us ADHD brains experience, typical situations when they might arise, how we can start recognizing them, and understanding why they're arising in those moments. Okay, so that's going to be the focus for this week. And in fact, I'm really kind of glad that it's working out this way, that we're dividing it into two parts, because creating this greater awareness in this first week is going to give you a lot more space to leverage what you're learning and then actually put it into practice over the next couple of weeks. So the supports you're going to learn in episode 247, next week's episode, can actually sink in, and you'll be able to start seeing those shifts. In other words, you're going to be able to build up awareness this week of all of the different emotions you're experiencing, so that next week, when you learn the strategies, you'll be ready to implement them. So this week, as you listen to the different emotions that we explore, the examples that I talk about, I encourage you to notice which ones come up most often for you, and when they most often arise, and how they feel physically. So the actual sensations in your body. Okay. And I will prompt about this throughout the episode. And then next week, after you've built up that awareness, we're going to talk about what we can actually do about it. Sound good? Awesome. Then let's dive into one of the core components of the ADHD experience, which is this world of emotions. And more specifically, those intense experiences where our emotions seem to have a mind of their own. And we're going to talk about how they show up and what to do about it when they arise around other people. You know what I'm talking about, right? Those experiences when we suddenly feel flooded with such a big emotion. It might be in the middle of a work meeting, or in a one-on-one with our boss, or when we're talking with a friend or a family member or our partner. And before we know it, there is this swell of emotion that bubbles up, and it manages to trigger this huge emotional response that doesn't seem to impact other people in the same way it seems to impact us. I have a feeling you know what I'm talking about here. If not, you have either A, done a remarkably amazing job of learning how to allow your emotions that it's just become so second nature you don't think twice about it, or B, you've learned to really push these big feelings down. Perhaps that was the message you had growing up, and you learned to tell yourself, I'm fine, everything's fine, we just move on. And those big feelings stay trapped inside. Because the truth is, those of us with ADHD do navigate really big feelings. And one of the most supportive things that we can do for ourselves is learn how to actually allow and move through these emotions in a supportive way. Feelings are here to teach us something. And I know that sounds strange. I know that sounds woo, but truly, these emotions are here to teach us something, because our brain has had a thought, it released some chemicals into our body is feeling something, and we can learn from that. We can figure out something about what this emotion is cueing. There is so much we can learn when we pause and check in. But this absolutely takes practice. And what's more, it is harder for an ADHD brain to actually pause and check in because we tend to get hit with bigger waves of emotion than our non-ADHD colleagues. So, what do we actually do about this? Because let's be honest, as emotional, highly sensitive humans, the chances of experiencing these big feelings around others is very real and likely to happen probably more often than we'd like. And often in these situations, the typical advice that you might hear when we feel emotionally dysregulated to, oh, just go take a walk or do some meditation or whatever, journal. That's not really a viable option when you're in a one-on-one with your boss, right? Suppose you could pull out your Calm app in the middle of that meeting and just start meditating, but you probably don't want to. So that's what we're exploring in this episode. We are looking at simple, discrete regulation techniques to help us soothe our overwhelming feelings, to help us calm our nervous system, and to stay more present in the moment until we have some quiet time to step away from the situation and have that proper intentional space to allow the big feelings to come up. So today we're going to look at how to support ourselves when we're feeling overwhelmed, anxious, frustrated, ashamed, or embarrassed. Okay, we're going to look at all of those emotions and then a few different approaches that we can use to help us move through them. Okay, so we'll talk about the emotions, then we'll talk about the strategies. Notice the ones that align, drop the ones that don't. You don't have to do all of them because, as I often say in this podcast to all my clients, as you always hear me say, what works for one person may not work for another. So use these suggestions, use these tips as a jumping off point to build your own supportive toolkit that you can then reach for whenever you notice these big feelings coming up and you're looking for a simple, discrete way to help you regulate and move through them. So, like I said, I'm going to start by talking about each of these different emotions and situations in which they might come up. And as I share them, notice if you relate to any of them, and also check in and see if your body is reacting to them in any way. Notice if they feel familiar to you. If so, it's probably a good indication that implementing some of the strategies that we'll talk about toward the end of the episode could be supportive. All right. So first emotion we're going to look at is overwhelm, which I know is something all of us navigate at different times. I have several episodes dedicated specifically to helping ourselves move through overwhelm. I will link to some of them in the show notes if you want to take this work a little bit deeper. But I often think about the feeling of overwhelm as this signal. Okay, it's a signal from our nervous system that we have reached our capacity. Our cup is full. We literally cannot pour anything else into it because it is full. And what we need is a moment to breathe. We need a moment to calm our racing mind and create some clarity on what actually matters in this moment. So this experience of overwhelm can show up, of course, in many different ways. So I'm going to give some different examples. Notice if any of them sound familiar to you. Maybe you are in a work meeting and it's a rather busy, chatty work meeting, and you are trying to grasp the scope of this big project that has really unclear responsibilities and deadlines, and you're feeling pretty swamped because you can't quite process the information because there's nothing that's very clear. Or maybe you're feeling overwhelmed when you are in a really crowded event and it's simply this barrage of noises and people and the heat of the space and all of this extra stimulation leads you to feeling incredibly overstimulated. That was a weird emphasis on the syllable, overstimulated. And it makes it hard to think clearly. Or maybe you are facing a really tight deadline and you have this mountain of tasks that you need to get through. You're looking at the deadline, you know someone's waiting on you, and you feel completely frozen, totally overwhelmed, unable to clarify what actually matters and make a plan and take action because everything feels equally urgent because your brain is so flooded. It's so overwhelmed thinking that everything needs to get done now. Okay. This is, of course, just a small handful of situations where you might find yourself feeling overwhelmed in the workplace or around other people. And again, I'm offering just a handful so you can start recognizing for yourself when you tend to drop into overwhelm more often. When does it come up most often for you? And also, how does it feel when you're feeling overwhelmed? Okay, this is the first step towards supporting ourselves in navigating these intense feelings in real time, is to actually start recognizing them and noticing when they show up. When does overwhelm come most often for you? What does it actually feel like in your body? What are the physical sensations? How do you know you're feeling overwhelmed versus frustrated? What's the difference in your body? Okay, this is step number one to learning how to regulate and support ourselves through the big feelings, is to first learn how to recognize them and when they show up most often. Speaking of which, let's move on to the next category of emotions that we might feel pretty often around other people in public spaces. And this is the feeling of anxiousness or anxiety. Okay. So the feeling of anxiety, the feeling of anxiousness, this is, again, a rather familiar emotional experience for many of us. I also want to mention that what I'm talking about here is the experience of anxiousness that kind of comes and goes in our lives. If you notice the level of anxiety is pretty consistent and it's impacting your day-to-day life on the regular, then I would highly encourage you to reach out to a therapist or your primary care doctor, because there is so much awesome support out there for anxiety, and they can absolutely help you to find the best care for your situation. So if it is this persistent anxiety that's really impacting your life on the day-to-day, there's even more great supports out there, okay? But in terms of the everyday feelings of anxiousness that kind of come and go, examples might be before a big presentation at work, or you need to introduce yourself in a new class or something, and there's this pressure to perform, and it spikes our worry and our anxiousness. You're presenting in some way, or you're presenting yourself to new people, and you feel this pressure to show up in a quote unquote right way. You might notice this feeling of anxiety. Or maybe you notice it in job interviews, or if you're about to take an important exam and your brain is telling you, hey, the stakes are really high. And also the outcome is super uncertain, so we should probably worry about this a lot. And then we start getting really anxious. Or maybe you're waiting on a performance review, and so you have this anticipation of feedback and that worry about the feedback and what you're going to hear. All of that can feel super nerve-wracking. So again, many of us know this anxiety quite well. It can show up in so many different situations. So like I said, with overwhelm, a powerful first step is creating awareness about when you notice the emotions arising most often, right? When does it come up in your life? Where do you notice it in your body? Do you notice that your heart beats a lot faster? Do you notice that you get more tired? Is your breathing more shallow? Is it up in your chest instead of down in your diaphragm? Does it feel tight in your chest? Get curious about the sensations so that you can start noticing them earlier as they start appearing in the experience. Okay? The third emotion that we're going to look at is frustration. Again, another familiar pastime for our ADHD brains. Frustration is actually an interesting emotion because it often arises when there is something that's blocking us from doing what we want to do. So we have this objective, or we have this goal or this plan we want to carry out, and despite working toward it, there is something blocking the way. And as ADHD brains generally, that something can be our poor executive functioning skills. And that can be super frustrating because we know what to do. Our brain tells us it shouldn't be that hard, but because our brain is wired differently and we may not have the supports in place yet, we keep feeling stuck. We keep feeling blocked from making the progress we want to make because our executive functions aren't showing up the way we want them to. That can be very frustrating. Now, I should clarify that it's not actually the lack of executive functions that are making us frustrated, but we have a whole lot of thoughts like, this should be easier. This shouldn't be so hard. I should be able to do this. And all of that makes us feel incredibly frustrated. Now, it's not just the executive functions. Frustration can show up in so many different areas. Maybe it's technology glitches. If you are Paula Engebretson, so let's say you're trying to figure something out. Seriously, I can just feel this frustration build in my chest in these situations. If I am working on something with tech and I can't figure out the problem, despite seemingly following all of the steps correctly, and it's not working, oh my gosh, I want to pull out my hair. It can also show up in terms of difficult interactions with colleagues or neighbors or any other human that you're interacting with. And the obstacle here is actually a breakdown of communication. And that breakdown of communication is actually blocking the resolution or the forward movement you want to make. It can also look like inefficiencies or red tape that often slows down a project or momentum you want to make. Anyone else get super frustrated by all of this? I mean, this again, big one for me, when you can clearly see a more efficient way, but there is someone or something blocking you from implementing the more efficient thing. Side note, I think this one is especially challenging for some of us who are really great at spotting patterns, and we're really good at seeing that bigger picture. And when other people don't see it, even though we know it will work, it is maddening. Hello, frustration. Okay, so that is just a handful of examples of frustration. Notice for you where you feel the frustration show up. Clearly, I have some specifics that I was sharing here, but my guess is you have some that are unique to you. They may not be around red tape or around tech not working, but there are probably a handful that sound familiar to you as well. All right. The last two emotions I'm actually going to group together, even though in probably every other podcast episode, I would keep them separate. But for time, I'm going to group them together. And these are the emotions of shame and embarrassment. Okay? Both are emotions that stem from perceived social scrutiny, but they differ subtly. Okay? So embarrassment usually occurs when we commit some sort of social faux pas. Okay, so we momentarily feel awkward, but we also can recognize that the incident is not a reflection of our core self, of who we are as humans. I really like how Brené Brown describes embarrassment as it's something that makes us feel foolish or uncomfortable, but it's not really about us as humans. Now, shame, on the other hand, cuts quite a bit deeper, and it creates this feeling of being fundamentally flawed or inadequate in some way. It's that I am wrong versus I did something wrong, which would be guilt, right? But we're just looking at shame and embarrassment right now. But shame really becomes this deeper held belief where you think you as a human are wrong, okay? So with embarrassment, maybe you did something that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable. You feel foolish. You're like, that was super awkward, right? But then shame, we take that on and it becomes quite deep. Now, despite the nuanced difference of these, both emotions can surface in some pretty similar situations, which is why I tended to group them together. Now, again, this is just a handful of examples. I'm sure we can list out many, many more. But the first area where I tend to notice both of these show up is making quote unquote public mistakes. So maybe we're at a conference giving a talk and stumble over our words, or we make a mistake about a fact or something, and somebody corrects us. Okay. So in this situation, maybe we feel embarrassment if we're more focused on, oh my gosh, I can't believe I made that mistake. I said the wrong thing. Or shame if we kind of internalize it and we go, oh my gosh, I'm so incompetent. I'm too stupid. I'm such a mess, right? And it becomes this much more internal thing rather than, oh, I said the wrong date. That's embarrassing. Instead, we make it much more about us and our character. Okay. So again, both can come up and then we might receive them differently. Speaking of, we have receiving criticism. Okay. So this is another area where we might either experience shame or embarrassment. Now, of course, we can experience lots of other emotions as well, but we're just talking about shame and embarrassment right here. So feedback, particularly in public situations, whether we're at work or in a volunteer type situation, or you're at a conference, what have you, it has the potential to bring up a bunch of thoughts that make us feel embarrassed about the actions that we took or the thing that we did. And that can quickly shift into shame if we start believing that the thing we did or the thing we said or didn't say reflects our overall ability, our overall character. And then the third area or general space where I tend to notice this come up is in social missteps, for lack of a better word. So these are those awkward moments in social interactions where we might feel embarrassed and we're like, God, I just said that out loud, and we get awkward and embarrassed about it. And again, it can also slip into shame if we start viewing them as this deeper evidence of a personal flaw or this personal shortcoming. Again, I really debated whether I should separate embarrassment from shame because they are two very different emotional experiences. But I did put them together because they do tend to show up in similar situations. And given the strategies that we talk about next, I think having them paired together works just as well because the strategies and the tools that we can put in place are similar for both types of emotions. Okay, so with that in mind, what can we do when we notice these big feelings come up? What do we do if we notice in a social situation that we are suddenly flooded by this feeling of overwhelm, or we're super anxious, or all of a sudden we're incredibly frustrated, or we are so embarrassed, or we're feeling a lot of shame? Okay, what can we do specifically? Firstly, I do encourage you to check in and see if you can potentially remove yourself from the situation for a couple of minutes. Now, I know I promised discrete regulation techniques for the times when we can't leave. Okay, so we are going to talk about that. But I do think it's helpful to remember that we can usually get up and leave in most situations. Now, we might not like the repercussion on the other side. Okay, but unless we're, I don't know, literally in an airplane or a moving car on the highway or something, you probably can step out for a moment. Again, I'm not saying you have to or you want to, but I like to remind myself that I can leave if I want to because it helps me feel like I'm not trapped. It helps me remember I don't have to stay. I have the choice. I might not take the choice, but I do have the choice to step out if I want to. Okay? I think sometimes we're so conditioned to think we have to stay when in reality, you know what? I could get up and use the restroom or step out of this congested area for a little while and get some fresh air. Okay? So for example, this past weekend was my niece Ava's birthday weekend, and she had her big class birthday party on Saturday. And oh my gosh, I was so excited to go and celebrate. I could not wait. I haven't been home for Ava's birthday yet. And it was just so special to be able to celebrate the entire weekend with her. With that being said, the Saturday class birthday party had almost 20 4 and 5-year-olds and just as many parents, and everyone was together in one space. And I'm not going to lie, that felt like a lot for my nervous system at times, especially right at the beginning as I was transitioning into so much more stimulation. And I noticed it especially, like I said, when the kids were arriving and everybody was kind of running around and waiting for the activities to start. So I'm in this transition mode, which of course you all know is not my favorite space. And then it was really stimulating. So I just mentioned, I'm going to just step out for a minute. I mean, there are plenty of adults around and stuff, so I knew it would be fine. I just said, I'm going to step out for a minute. And the party was at this nature conservatory. It was so fun. Seriously, it was so fun. But upstairs in this conservatory were these quiet rooms with floor to ceiling windows and a bunch of bird feeders outside. And they set up these beautiful big rocking chairs up next to the window so you could literally just sit there and watch the birds eat. And both my dad and I stepped out for a few minutes and we watched the birds and we chatted, and I could feel my nervous system calm down a bit. And then I was able to return and keep helping out. But I just knew that I needed to step out in this transition moment with all of the running around and yelling and all the things so that I could keep showing up throughout the party. So I do want to offer the reminder that often there is this option to step out and step away. And I know it's not always available, and I know that it is an option you might not want to choose, but there may be that option to excuse yourself to the restroom, to get a drink of water, to even turn off your camera if you're feeling Zoom fatigue, right? My eyes need a break from the screen. I'm still here. I'm still listening. I just need to turn off my camera for 5 minutes and give yourself that space. Don't forget that that is often an option. So this week, I encourage you to start building that valuable awareness around your emotional experience. Where do you notice the feeling of overwhelm coming up? When are you feeling anxious? When do you find yourself feeling frustrated or embarrassed? Or when is shame sneaking in? Perhaps you even set a reminder on your phone to go off once a day or a couple times a day throughout the week and note whether you have noticed any of these emotions arising throughout the day. And if so, when? How did they feel? What was going on specifically? How did you react? And by creating this awareness and gathering this valuable data, you're setting yourself up for success to actually implement the strategies and the tools that we're going to talk about next week. And then next week, in episode 247, we are diving into the next step by looking at specific strategies to help you not just navigate these big emotions, but also move through them when you are in public around other humans. Because let's be real, sometimes we don't want to just pull out a journal and write about our feelings if we're spiraling in a one-on-one with our boss. Sometimes we need slightly more discreet ways of supporting ourselves through these big feelings. So next week is all about discreet supports that you can keep in your ADHD toolkit to help you calm your nervous system, take care of yourself, and stay present in the way that you want to. So make sure that you tap the follow button on whatever podcast player you use to ensure you do not miss next week's episode 247. All right, my friends, that's going to do it for us this week. And if you are ready to learn how to navigate these big emotions in your life so you can get out of feeling stuck and start taking more action, if you're ready to learn how to support your ADHD in a way that's best for you and your brain, I invite you to check out today's show notes where you can learn more about how we can work together, both in my small group coaching program, We're Busy Being Awesome, and through one-on-one coaching. Also, if you want to learn my simple step-by-step approach to locking in a routine and making it stick, be sure to check out my free course, The ADHD Routine Revamp. You can tap through the link in the show notes or head to I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/routine to sign up. Until next time, keep being awesome. I'll talk with you soon.